Good afternoon. It's Monday, the 16th of November 2015, just after 1 o'clock. Welcome to UK Column Live News. I'm your host, Mike Robinson. And joining me today, we've got Patrick Henningsen and Vanessa Beeley. And of course, the story of the weekend is what was going on in Paris on Friday, the 13th in the evening. And Patrick, there have been warnings that something like this was going to happen in Paris for some time, but nonetheless, it seems to have been quite a surprise to many.
Well, it did happen. It happened 10 months ago in January with the Charlie Hebdo attacks. But of course, this one was scaled up to a much larger scale, multiple locations, multiple shooters, multiple suicide bombers, etc. So it shouldn't come as any surprise to anybody because there's been a number of harbingers, not just this year, but of course before that. But the question is, obviously, and we'll get into this conversation, is who actually did it, and that's not as clear as the media or government officials would like to paint it as a fait accompli.
Yeah, indeed,
Yep.
because many of the mainstream press describing this as an ISIS attack from very early on, before they really had any evidence of who had done it, and of course we had the magic passports appeared very quickly.
Yeah, the magic passports. So you can't have a terrorist event these days without passports. It's a very important set piece in the narrative. So we can start with 9/11. Magic passports appeared at the foot of one of the World Trade Centers. Mohammed Atta, the Egyptian hijacker, allegedly his passport, mint condition, survived the incineration of a jetliner in a building. And then, of course, last year, Charlie Hebdo, they wouldn't have been able to piece together the narrative of the Kouachi brothers, or even catch them for that matter, had it not been for one of the Kouachi brothers had magically left his ID card on the alleged getaway car that the authorities found, and that was how they stitched together the narrative. Without that, without the magic passport or without the magic ID card, there was absolutely no way to even stitch together the narrative, apprehend or give chase to the alleged terrorist and so forth. So it is a very, very important part. And of course, they had three of them uh, that I've seen so far. That a Syrian passport and then two Turkish passports. And now the media is basically walking that back after they introduced that into the story, the plot line. Then they walked it back earlier yesterday, saying that these could be fake. They could, in fact, they are fake. They're all fake. So it begs the question, Mike, that why would you bring a passport to a terrorist event if you're going to detonate a suicide vest afterwards, and B, why would you bring a fake passport to a terrorist event as well? It just doesn't make any sense at all. You don't need a passport to travel through Paris. I'm sorry. Um,
Indeed, and there has been quite a reaction on social media. This on Twitter, whenever a terrorist dies, passports fall like manna from heaven around them, and we've seen some attempts at humour over the issue, so there's clearly a lot of cynicism and skepticism amongst the social media players in this, and is this why they're starting to backtrack on the issue?
It is. It is. I mean, gosh, with the way they construct these passports, I'd say that who needs Kevlar vests? Who needs body armor? You just staple a bunch of passports to your camo outfit or your jumpsuit, and you're basically bulletproof. You're incendiary proof. It's the greatest material ever invented by mankind. So I don't mean to make light of it, Mike, but it is kind of ridiculous, really.
Indeed, and I
So
mean, I will say that as this program progresses, we are going to comment on a lot of what's been in the media, and we're by no means wanting to sort of. This is not a criticism of the people that were injured or killed in this event. In fact, of course, we extend our condolences to them and their families. But there are strange aspects to this entire thing which need to be discussed, and we shouldn't really allow the the emotion of the thing to distract from that discussion. I think you would agree with that.
I would, Mike. But the thing that we're trying to analyze here, it even defies analysis because it's like a dumbed down template of a narrative, and we see this time and time again with every single one of these so-called terror events. It's a watered down, dumbed down, simple Jack narrative of what happened. It defies all logic and all real-world parameters, and you're meant to buy into this without questioning it, and just meant to take it, lock, stock, just swallow the whole thing, and no questions at all.
Yeah.
And when it and rarely it makes any sense at all, and neither does this one. And there's a number of anomalies that we've made a list of. You can go down one by one. So all we're doing, Mike, is we're doing what the media should be doing, which is we should be questioning the official story, the official narrative. And with all of these mass casualty events that quickly become politicized, especially if you throw Islam into the mix, they immediately become politicized, and one can't question any aspect of it at all. So it's such a low standard. Like, they lower the bar so low in terms of evidence, forensic explanations. It seems to all go out the window if there is Islam involved, or if it's deemed a terrorist event. So in a court of law or a normal criminal case, there's no way that they could make any of these sweeping statements that they've been making within minutes or hours of this event being reported, much less even 48 hours after. And yet the candlelight vigils and the bombers have already been deployed, and the bombs have already dropped in Syria. So it is extraordinary, and I think people should just take a step back and look at what sort of drama is unfolding, and how people's emotions are being manipulated in lightning speed time, and wars are being started. People are getting killed. Billions of dollars of military assets are being repositioned, all because of what? Because the narrative has been decided. Basically, ISIS did it, and it's ISIS, and we need to be ruthless in our response. Are the words of Francois Hollande. I mean, it is incredible. It's kind of like it's like watching a Batman film. Basically, it's that simplistic in terms of the storyline.
Okay, well, Vanessa, obviously, I'm interested in getting an idea of what has been going on from the French political class. So obviously, Hollande came out and said it was an act of war by Islamic State. We've got EU leaders threatening to use all necessary means, according to the Telegraph here, in the war on ISIL. What has been the response in France generally? You need to unmute your mic, sorry.
It's going to take a few days for the dust to settle and for the lines to be drawn, but we're certainly seeing an initial, obvious, fairly rapid response from the politicians here. I mean, Valls has already stated the same as Hollande: we must annihilate ISIS, we must destroy them wherever they are in the world. He's also basically called for the revoking of French nationality for anybody that speaks out against the, in inverted commas, republic. We have certain French mayors, and again, we talked about this morning, the mayors in France have huge influence. There's one mayor of a town, Venelle, who has over 8,000 inhabitants. He's calling for the fact that he wants the Muslim faith banned in France. He's calling for a Marshall Plan to send Muslims back to the countries where religion is practiced. I mean, this is sort of almost Spanish Inquisition type stuff going on now.
And we had another example of that with a French minister discussing radical mosques and using some pretty emotive language, dissolution of mosques.
Yep, absolutely. So, we are going to see a tremendous, we're going to see, various repercussions from this in France and globally. But I think, yes, the important one is we saw a backlash against the already marginalized and largely ghettoized Muslim communities in France after Charlie Hebdo. And in fact, Thierry Meyssan, at that time a political commentator, made the point that he considered that this was a drive to create almost certainly a civil war, but as we've also discussed, this goes beyond the civil war. This goes into complete chaos if this is allowed to unravel according to the media and government narratives. And also, that there's been this banning of halal food in schools, the banning of the hijab. I mean, France has been pretty much the most belligerent European country against the Islamic faith, despite having, in Europe, the largest Muslim population. And so we're going to see certainly a lot of influence go over to the far right in France. We're going to see Le Pen riding on the wave of public opinion following these attacks. I also do believe that we will see a reaction against that, as we have seen. I think it was in Lille where far-right demonstrators tried to intercede on a vigil for the victims in Paris, and they were chased away by the mourners. So it's gone. I think we're going to see this unravel over the next days, weeks, and it will be interesting to see how France reacts. Both the population, the government we know are now going to become even more draconian. They're going to crack down on dissidents. They're going to introduce even greater measures of intellectual terrorism. And, we've been resisting almost the Patriot Act introduction in France, but we are there. I mean, I'm seeing friends who are activists being persecuted. I'm seeing Christophe Oberlin, who's an eminent French surgeon who's been to Gaza many times to work during the Israeli offensives there, who's being taken to court because he introduced photographs of Gazan victims in his university lectures. So, and we have also the persecution of Dieudonné, the Cameroonian comedian who is being accused of anti-Semitism. So France has been under this draconian law shadow for many months, if not years now. But it's definitely going to be increased now.
Yeah, so it's a potential powder keg. Now, Patrick, over the weekend when we were talking about this, I asked you the question: was Paris revenge for Jihadi John? The Daily Mail decided to ask that question over the weekend as well. But actually, the Mail probably answered that for themselves in July this year when they had this article saying ISIS will fill the streets of Paris with dead bodies. And this is a French jihadi's vile threat as he shoots Syrian soldier in the head and kicks his body off a cliff. Now, a very large aspect of the narrative in the UK has been this notion of homegrown terrorism. And this idea is clearly being implanted in the minds of the French at the moment, and Charlie Hebdo was a key part of that. Also the alleged gun incident on the train. But for some reason, France has been the sort of focus of the ISIS rhetoric for quite a number of weeks and months. Have you any understanding of why that is?
Yeah, I do actually. I just want to add straight away, the other threat that was made to France was by Benjamin Netanyahu, who came out very vocally, very publicly months ago, saying that France will they will regret recognizing Palestine as a state, or when they gave them some recognition. I believe it was at the on an international level via the UN. I'm not sure, but that quote was made. That threat, it was kind of a veiled threat by Netanyahu. So make of that what you will. That to me is very significant, definitely significant. But and again, that also could very well feed into the reality as well that France, the United States really needs. They need another leading or central player in NATO, because what's transpired geopolitically over the last say 15 years is the United States is no longer recognized as an honest broker on the international stage. They're no longer recognized as a honest referee, an arbiter of international affairs, and so forth. So The United States cannot act unilaterally, of course. They can within sort of Confederate coalitions, but they need to do so with the British and only not without the British. So the other attempts at coalitions have been total failures. So that leaves NATO as the multilateral institution of choice for military intervention. And NATO is really an arm of the U.S. defense establishment because the United States, in terms of contributions militarily to NATO, the United States is responsible for about 75% of the total NATO spending. So effectively, when you talk about NATO, you're talking about the United States. So it's just another banner. It's another flag they can fly to get what they need to get done militarily around the world. So if you look at this as an international racketeering operation, then that's basically, they're able to do that with NATO through another color, under another mafia flag, if you will. So, but they need another major protagonist in NATO to step forward, and the British can't do it because the British Air Force only has, I don't know how many Typhoons they've got that are operational, but it can't be more than a dozen. I don't know what they've got.
I think you're not far off the mark there, yeah.
The British military is almost non-existent in terms of world ranking. So, but France, on the other hand, they still have, they're still within the sort of recent history of having national service. They do have a large defense force. They've got a very good level of spending militarily. But if you look at France's problems, this is important. Mike Whitney from Counterpunch magazine was on my show earlier today, and he made a point that I thought was very apt. He said that France's problems really began well and truly in 2009 when they rejoined NATO. So, and before that, France didn't have nearly the sort of problems and weren't embroiled in some of the problems that they are now. So, but this is a way of forcing France into pole position that the U.S. cannot, they can't perform that role anymore, not alone anyway. And France has its fingers in all sorts of pies in Cameroon, with Boko Haram, in that part of Africa, in West Africa. They've got their fingers in Mali. They've got their fingers in a number of other places as well, North Africa, of course.
And these are colonial fingers, of course.
They are. So this France is really the optimum geostrategic partner for the United States militarily. They are the one. So and they have a good stay behind operation in a number of their former colonies, including Syria, including Lebanon, including the African countries, Burkina Faso, Mali, Cameroon, Senegal. France has a stay-behind intelligence operation in Chad, Central African Republic, a country that they have tipped over in recent years, and in backing Islamic fighting groups to do that, and in Libya too, and in Syria. And France is, according to The Guardian, which we have on our website right now at 21st Century Wire, early on in 2012, France openly boasting how it's of sending cash and weapons to the armed opposition in Syria. So France has blood on their hands, and so you could say that they are responsible. If you go for and this is the thing, if you're going for the orthodox ISIS narrative, you're buying into this idea that ISIS carried out these terror attacks, then if you're going by that sort of storyline, then you could say that France is getting blowback for the monster that it created. But I'm afraid I've heard this a lot in the sort of petty bourgeois, faux left-wing media organizations. That's the sort of safe storyline to take, like, oh, it's blowback, right? But nobody wants to actually admit that there are clandestine operations, that Operation Gladio was a real historical phenomenon in Europe that spanned 3 decades, and nobody has gone to jail, no high-ranking public officials, for the slaughter that they are responsible for on European soil, doing domestic terrorism with government sponsorship. So if no one has gone to jail and nobody has been nicked for that, then you can only assume, Mike, that that operation is still active because no one's been pulled up on it. And this is just what we're seeing today is a return to the glory days of 1970s and 80s domestic terrorism in Europe and the political divisiveness that goes along with that. But it only, instead of communism and and Western Europe and Eastern Europe and Marxism and the Red Brigades. Now it's all drawn along religious lines. That's the only difference. So you look at this as Gladio B, as some people refer to it, or Gladio 2.0. It's just a different type of a Gladio operation that we're looking at, but with joint intelligence agencies working together as they did in Gladio from different countries. So interagency cooperation, and there was a layer below that some cells within the cells that the government were managing or handling that nobody knew. Even the directors of the intelligence agencies didn't know what they were doing. And meanwhile, Bologna bombing comes and 82 people end up dead in an Italian train terminal. Okay, and no inquiry, no real trial. Just it sort of ends up getting fleshed out. 20 years later, and nobody cares by now because a lot of the major players have either moved out or have died by now. So I believe that this is exactly what we're seeing here, and France is being manipulated into a different geopolitical role, and this is also being used to balkanize and polarize Europe and sort of guarantee that we're going to have a nice long conflict that might last, a multi-regional conflict that might last for 30 or 40 years.
I mean, the Pope's been calling this I can't remember the exact term, but he's certainly describing it as a sort of fractional Third World War. Almost, it is perpetual war on a sort of piecemeal basis across the world. It's not there's not a Maginot Line this time, but it is very much looking like a Clash of Civilizations type operation, isn't it?
Sure. Yeah, it is. It is. It's not. I mean, if the Pope's talking about a Third World War, well, it well and truly began in 1991 with the Operation Desert Storm. You could say that might be the beginning of the Third World War proper. It's just been drawn out over a longer period of time. It's a protracted asymmetric war working through proxies. There's no way that any Western European countries or the Americans have the stomach to go toe-to-toe with another nation-state's military. So as you can see, this is all very clever dancing around having to have any of that type of situation occur. They'd rather work through proxies, destroy countries within. That's exactly what we've seen in Syria. That's what we saw in Libya. And maybe come over with airstrikes to finish it off at the end. Just put a layer of frosting on top of the cake. That's what we saw in Libya. And that's what they would like to do in Syria, quite obviously. So why does everyone have such a short memory, as if Libya didn't happen in 2010 and 11? It did. They took down a nation state, and look at it now, it collapsed. And that nation state, of course, is one of the main corridors for the so-called migrant crisis into Europe, which I think isn't as much of a crisis as the media has engineered it to be. A country like Lebanon is the size of Wales, and they have taken in 1.5 million Syrian refugees since 2011, and they don't talk about it like it's a crisis. I mean, the size of Wales, Mike, and the whole of Europe. I don't know what Europe has absorbed in terms of Syrian refugees, but it's a pinprick compared to what Lebanon has. And Lebanese society hasn't collapsed. There's put some stress on it, yes, but it hasn't collapsed. It's because the attitude is different, and they haven't created a media event out of it in the same way that the West have, in order to polarize communities and classes and countries and ethnic groups in Europe, to create an environment of insecurity or perceived insecurity, which automatically gives the state or the European superstate or law enforcement greater license to implement things like biometric real ID systems, which you will see this coming week. I guarantee it, Mike. We're going to see this as a talking point, probably coming out of the Home Office or something like this. It's been talked about already, but now it'll really be ramped up, and people questioning the Schengen visa agreement and so forth. So, and again, this pressure is just to implement more security measures. I am absolutely positive of it, because this is one of the biggest gravy trains in the 21st century, is the security industrial complex, and you need existential threats. You need crises. It's constant. You need to keep them coming in order to keep the budgets high and to allocate more money for the following year and plunge each of these governments into greater debt and so forth. And we see this cycle going around and around. So that's the way I see this particular crisis. But it gives a lot of license for a lot of things that would be outrageous in any other time or situation. And a lot of it's media driven, Mike. It's in terms of real threats. Um, I question that this is as big of a threat as it is, but the media coverage and the political rhetoric makes it a major thing. It makes it a major threat. But if you look in terms of risk analysis, it's not as high on the list as a lot of other things.
Absolutely. Now, of course, by Saturday morning, we were already seeing the bogus security alerts all over the place, attempting to persuade us that we are really under threat. So Gatwick Airport evacuated because somebody was apparently running around with a gun. Well, it turned out it was an air rifle in his baggage. And we had a French-bound airliner grounded at Amsterdam. Vanessa, this is ridiculous. This was over a threatening tweet. So we're not even seeing these events being driven by real things on the ground, but now we're seeing these events being driven by what somebody might put out on Twitter. And of course, yesterday, Vanessa, we had the situation of Channel 4 News and a bunch of other news reporters being at one of the sites of some of the events on Friday night, and suddenly a large proportion of the crowd running away in panic, and just conveniently in time for live broadcasts on various news channels. What is the feeling in France at the moment? Is this rhetoric causing more and more fear? Is this being driven?
Yeah, I mean, I think obviously it's going to have an effect on those who are influenced by the media in France. And I think the problem is very similar, again, to the UK. You have certain leftist, supposedly or ostensibly anti-imperialist media publications that are still running with the mainstream narrative, very much like The Guardian will do, for instance, in the UK. They'll put out some stories that pull you in and make you believe that they're on our side to some extent, and then they'll hit you with again the mainstream narrative. And so we are definitely going to see that in France. But there is a burgeoning alternative media apparatus in France, and this is what I think they're going to start to try and hit, because they are worried by it. I mean, there's organizations like Égalité et Réconciliation that is run by Alain Soral. Alain Soral basically predicted this over 3 years ago now. He said this is where we are heading. We have Panamza, who did an absolutely fantastic job on completely deconstructing the Charlie Hebdo attacks. I mean, within days of the attacks, they were on it, and their investigation was probably the benchmark for most people that were looking for information on it being a false flag. So there are, if you like, underground dissident media in France that are definitely going to pick this up and run with it. And I think there's a growing number of the population who are following that and who are going to be waiting for their analysis before they make their decisions on what has happened. But, we saw this in the UK with the bringing down of the Russian passenger jet, that almost immediately the British media were calling for no people to go to Sharm, which was then again one of the most destructive reactions they could have on the Egyptian economy and on Egyptian tourism. So that's a definite slap back down for Egypt. Don't you step out of line, because we're going to destroy your economy. And so we see this again and again. We were talking this morning, and I noticed that in Beirut, that the day before the Paris attacks, they had their own ISIS attack. The media presented it as an attack on the Hezbollah stronghold or the Hezbollah bastion, so therefore completely marginalizing the death of civilians in Beirut. But also what we see now is that the Beirut authorities, in alliance with Hezbollah, they have arrested the perpetrators, who have turned out to be Lebanese and Syrian, not Palestinian, as being presented by the mainstream media, who are wanting to sow sedition and sectarian rife in all our countries, including now Europe. So we see them arrest the perpetrators, and yet we see this pattern all the time. Like in France, whenever there is one of these attacks, funnily enough, all of the perpetrators are eliminated. That is mirrored, if you like, in Israel. We see alleged attackers being eliminated. We never hear of them being arrested or being investigated. They're simply eliminated. And we as the public and the media particularly should be asking questions. And these questions are never asked. And this is one thing that we must say to the public. Why are our media, who presumably have freedom of speech and are in fact representing our best interests, why do they never ask the questions that should ensure that our best interests are protected? They don't, because they're protecting the interests of the ruling elite. So they're basically running with whatever narrative suits the agenda of the ruling elite. They're certainly not doing what protects our interests.
Absolutely. And Patrick, one of the narratives which has been presented in the Western media has been this notion that the response has been global. So we had London suddenly providing all these monuments with red, white and blue lights installed. I'm not quite sure how they got them installed quite so quickly, but this was global. Here we've got Sydney, we've got San Francisco, we've got United Arab Emirates, we've got Calgary in Canada, we've got Rotterdam, we've got Mumbai, and we've got Rio de Janeiro, and we've even got relatively insignificant cities in the United States like Milwaukee, all suddenly with red, white and blue lights installed. Now, I'm not sure whether those lights are genuinely installed or whether these images are manipulated in some way, but the impression that is given, or the image that wants to be given, is that this is a global response to a global terrorist threat.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, what this does is, let's put this into perspective for a minute, okay? And I appreciate that a lot of people are showing their compassion and what they believe is their solidarity with the French people who are victims of this horrific terror attack. And there's lots of hashtag campaigns, and people are changing their Facebook icons to have French flag flying over their face, and that's all wonderful. But my question is this, okay? There were people killed in a real bombing in Beirut just a few days ago. Why are people not draping the Lebanese flag over their Facebook page? Why are there no hashtags for the dead people in Lebanon? Okay, why are there no hashtags for the school full of school kids in Kenya a few years ago that was gunned down by terrorists, 140 of them, in fact, just laying their face on the ground, just bleeding out. What about these people? And this happens so many times around the world. What this is this call of solidarity. It's only with Western European and with North American people. Okay, everybody else is second-class world citizen. Okay, so all this does is it reinforces a neo-colonial hierarchy. Okay, and I'm going to call it like it is, because to me it's there's been a lot of other people who've been mowed down in mass casualties in Africa, in Asia, in Southeast Asia, in lots of places around the world, and no one has shed a tear for them on Facebook or on Twitter, and there's no sort of mainstream media newspapers spearheading all these wonderful front page photo features of all this solidarity and stuff. And I think it's a problem, okay, because it does reinforce an international hierarchy of sorts, and it does put sort of value on certain people over others. It does. You can't get around that. So in a way, it's a little bit of international political engineering, and although there's a lot of goodwill flowing towards France right now, that means nothing. And I'll tell you why. Because in the aftermath of 9/11, there was never such an outpouring of goodwill for America, for Americans. The world came to America and laid wreaths at their feet from all over the world. Even in Palestine, they were sending their goodwill. Yasser Arafat even gave his public condolences immediately, okay? Now, you contrast that with what's happening now. America lost that goodwill within months, and it soon became the sort of bad boy of the international scene, okay? And no one has any sympathy for America today internationally. If you look at the overall public opinion, it's very much skeptical of America, their motives, politically, diplomatically, backing false flags, lying, demonizing Russia, throwing out bad intelligence and calling it fact, or calling it evidence, like they've done in the Ukraine over MH17 is a good example. And when the Russian airliner crashed, 220 odd Russian passengers perished in the Sinai Peninsula a few weeks ago, and the only major world leader not to break from his golf schedule to give his condolences was Barack Obama. So does that mean that Russian citizens are not worth as much? Because that's the message it's sending. Okay.
Well, and indeed, and the Charlie Hebdo response to that echoes that, does it not?
Yeah, it was disgusting what Charlie Hebdo did, and I'm not afraid to say that, even in light of what happened on Friday. Charlie Hebdo made fun of Russian victims, cartoons falling from the plane on top of a head of an Arab cartoon guy with a long beard in the Sinai, and made some crack about that you should have taken the cheaper airline or something like this. I mean, it's disgusting. But that's just all in the spirit of free speech, I guess, and democracy with the great, wonderful publication, Charlie Hebdo. So it's a lot of international provocation, a lot of incendiary moves by some of these, what I think, what they're actually functionaries of NATO foreign policy, really. This is for, it is sad, Mike, but there is no reciprocity internationally when it comes to these sort of issues anymore. It is so polarized, it's so toxic that I've lost a lot of confidence by looking at sort of the way certain politicians carry on some things, and on other things they're nowhere to be found.
Right. So Pat, a moment ago, Vanessa used the term false flag, and part and parcel of the whole false flag thing is the media response and the kind of stories that we start to see in the media immediately following these kind of events. And you highlighted the fact that this gentleman has appeared in the media almost immediately. News.Mike is one of the websites that you pointed to in that article. Charlie Hebdo hero amongst the first responders to Paris attack. Now, in many of the other events which we might class as false flags that have happened in the last 20 years or so, we have seen the fact that there is usually a drill of some kind associated with these events. And right enough, when we come to Paris, we find that on the morning of Friday night's attacks, that morning, emergency services in Paris, as according to The Guardian, had actually done a training exercise for a major terrorist attack. We were well prepared, but the type of attack is significant. It's the methodical gunning down of everyone, a little like a video game. And the Australian then goes into further detail, because what they say is that practice run, this drill that was happening on the morning of the attack, was a mass casualty event, a multi-site mass casualty event. You look at 9/11, you look at 7/7, and the coincidences here are stark.
Yeah, absolutely. They are indeed. I mean, the problem with this is not only was there a drill on the day, a multi-agency drill, but you have one of the protagonists from the Charlie Hebdo drama is the sort of front and center. He was one of the first responders there on the scene, as if by magic. And so this is the establishment saying, well, thank God we had this multi-agency drill, because had we not been having the drill that mirrored what really happened that night, that we wouldn't have all our EMTs and our first responders on the scene. So actually, it was just so fortunate, right? Same thing that Peter Power said right in the aftermath of 7/7. So Peter Power, who was head of Visor Consultants, practicing for a terror drill in the city. Wow, bombs hitting the very same tube stations that the so-called terrorists allegedly hit on the morning of 7/7. And wow, we had to switch from real-time thinking to quick-time doing, I think was the words he used. So extraordinary, absolutely extraordinary. And the ITV news anchor just said, "Wow, that is extraordinary." It's just incredible. No challenging at all. No digging, saying, "Wait a minute, that's a little bit too much of a coincidence." And here we see this pattern again. We saw the same on 9/11. We also saw bomb drills, and at the Boston bombings. We had a bomb drill on the morning of the marathon as well. So every time you see a terrorist event, we see a drill. So at some point, after sort of 4 or 5 of these, you got to be thinking right at that point that if you have any brain activity, you have to be thinking, well, maybe this is more than a coincidence.
So Pat, this I mean, am I being overly cynical here? But this looks to me like what we have is a terrorist event perpetrated by the Western security services in some way, and then layered on top of that, we've got this massive PR exercise where they roll out the same crisis actors every time, and they have the same type of sanitized images that they can publish as widely as possible without offending people too much, just enough to be able to build the narrative, but not enough to actually put real dead bodies in front of people. And it seems like we've got this sort of dual thing going on where the actual event happens, and on top of that, there is a PR narrative which is very well managed going on at the same time.
Yeah. I mean, I would be careful not to characterize this in too simplistic terms, but in terms of the narrative, in terms of the public relations, that's already set into place even before the event. And if you look at, especially with this event, how easy the media basically fell into place and settled right into their niches, right into their talking points, because those talking points were already carved out long before Friday night. So it was very seamless in terms of how the rollout of the talking points came. I think that it's possible that this could be elements of intelligence services, European, American, Israeli, but also we don't know for sure. There could also be elements of organized crime. There could also be elements of private mercenary firms. To me, this is more likely that governments would use contractors or work through a proxy who hires the contractors. So there's absolute, 4 or 5 level deniability, and also Islamist extremists as well are in that mix too. So they could perform certain tasks. So I think it is very easy to engineer this when you have so many cells that are being managed by covert or confidential informants. And even then, today I saw on CNN a former CIA undercover guy who's now a congressman in Texas admitted on the air, and we'll play this on our show on Wednesday, saying that this is a great time for us to seed our people into Al Qaeda and ISIS to make sure that we know what's going on. So when they say that publicly, that means they've already done it. Okay.
Yeah.
So, and I could say the same with French intelligence. Definitely Belgium is the wheelhouse for this. And with British intelligence, those cases are very well known about a number of high-level, high-profile informants out of Finsbury Park Mosque, for instance. So there's a lot of this gray area that overlaps with the law enforcement, security services, organized crime, and so-called terrorist cells, okay? And private security firms or mercenary firms or private intelligence firms. So, and guns for hire. So there's a lot of overlap there. In this gray area, I have, it's anyone's guess who would be the best suited to carry out this attack. But I will say this, that of some of the eyewitness descriptions that I have seen, some people said they looked very commando-like, very professional, didn't talk, very sort of cold and calculated. Okay, these aren't the types of people that you get to string on a suicide bomb vest, for starters. Okay, so who knows what blew up after the gunman left through the back door of the theater.
Yeah, because so far with regard to the suicide bomb vest, the only evidence that we've got is a finger, apparently.
Sure, and then they had, as if by magic, had a DNA match in advance of this very person, which I find amazing too. But they've posted a lot of people's IDs and faces on the news today. Some victims, some people that are on the run. We don't know who's who. And in fact, it's preposterous to say that you would know that ISIS carried out this terrorist attack, because who is ISIS? ISIS is not an organization. It is not a state. It doesn't really have an administrative hierarchy. It's a brand. It's a label. It's a label that gets applied to anybody that the media or Western governments feel like applying it to.
Just like Al-Qaeda, in fact.
The reality is there's hundreds of factions right now in Syria that comprise the so-called armed opposition or the Islamic opposition. Hundreds of factions, okay, within Syria and northern Iraq. So this label gets applied very loosely. You can zero down into specifics, and Vanessa's done a good job with some of her investigations in looking at the overlap between some of these terrorist groups in Syria and some of these NGOs doing humanitarian work. So that's interesting. That just shows you how confusing and how difficult it is for the layperson to navigate this. And definitely it's way too complex for journalists, for any of the mainstream newspapers or television. They don't even want to go there. And in fact, a lot of times they can't go there because if there's any intelligence element to it, it's off limits.
Yeah.
You can't look into it. You can't ask questions about it. You cannot report on it. It's off limits. You can't do it. So that's what we're left with in terms of a media. So we, the public, have to accept the sort of canned narrative every time. And we're never allowed to look under the surface. We're never allowed to really investigate. Only for independent in people we can do that, or only when whistleblowers come out is that able to happen. Otherwise, the mainstream press has failed abysmally in this department. And Turkey, just the existence of Turkey and the role they've played in destabilizing Syria for the last 5 years, and how they've been able to get away with what they've gotten away with, hosting all the terrorist groups in their country and allowing them to sort of go over the Syrian border back and forth at will, but obviously not letting Syrian soldiers chasing them come over the Turkish border, because that would make an international incident. So Turkey has facilitated this destabilization of Aleppo and large parts of northern Syria, and it's shameful. So same with Jordan. Jordan has been doing this in the South Syrian's border, and to me, this is an international war crime. And not even to say what the Western countries are doing in terms of supplying money and CIA operatives on the ground, working with al-Nusra Front, Al-Qaeda affiliates, flooding the region with weapons. Okay, this is a violation of international law on so many levels. U.S. conducting airstrikes in a sovereign country's territory without asking for any permission, with no UN resolution. So this is really the death knell of the United Nations. This is more than any other event. I mean, it was bad with Iraq and with Afghanistan, okay? But this, more than any situation, has transformed the UN into an impotent League of Nations. More than, and what is going to ensue in the next couple of weeks, or what's already happened tonight with France conducting airstrikes in Syria, is really the death of the UN. To me, this is the most worrying thing that we need to look at right now, internationally, collectively. Everyone needs to really pay attention to this, because this is very dangerous waters that we're going into here, with undeclared wars and no international body with any cohesion whatsoever be able to act as a counterbalance to what is clearly a unilateral move on the region by a multilateral institution called NATO.
Yeah.
Okay, so
completely agree. Now, Vanessa, the news from France earlier was don't link Paris attacks to the migrant crisis. Now, that was from the German Interior Minister, we've got more and more stories appearing about how these attackers in Paris have allegedly slipped into Europe with the refugees. And of course, many people were warning about this for, pretty much since the refugee crisis began. But actually, this is a pretty dangerous situation, powder keg building within Europe, within France specifically, but within Europe in general. So you mentioned earlier that you used the word chaos. This goes beyond just. I mean, potentially we are looking at the situation where people are believing the idea that they don't know who to trust. They don't know who to trust, their neighbors or not. And potentially we've got Christian, in inverted commas, against Muslim. We've got individual against the state, because as the state ramps up the security situation, there's going to be problems there as well. But this really genuinely has the potential to turn into a chaotic event.
Yeah, I mean, I think, can I just very quickly, I will answer that, but can I just very quickly run through 2 or 3 other major anomalies that I think must be pointed out regarding the reporting on the actual attacks?
Yes.
One is that nobody appears to have picked up on this, but approximately 2 weeks before the Friday terrorist attacks, there was a meeting between CIA Director John Brennan with France Security Chief Bernard Bachelet, alongside intel chiefs from Britain and Israel, to discuss cyber and homeland security 2 weeks before the terrorist attack. Now, we know also that in the UK, particularly, reports have come out recently, people have picked up on the fact that the UK cybersecurity has been put in the hands of Israel. So, you know, this may be coincidental, but it would be interesting to know what their conversation was about. There's also the fact that prior to the friendly football match between Germany and France, which President Hollande attended, which, by the way, was also attended by, coincidentally, the daughter of a Fox News anchor. We also can't forget that there was the Charlie Hebdo Patrick Palou, who happened to be present at the event. There was also Le Monde, Danny Psisney, who was filming miraculously from the window. So, you know, even more so than Charlie Hebdo, there were people that just coincidentally happened to be there at the right time. I think at Charlie Hebdo, it was France 24 that were tweeting almost before they'd finished shooting. And bear in mind that France 24 is the Israeli-run France channel in France. But prior to the football match, there was footage of an Abu Dhabi sports commentator. And they asked him, obviously in Arabic, but they said, you know, how is the atmosphere? And he said, well, actually, it's pretty tense because security received terror threats just before the match. You know, this was publicly put out there. And the fact is that even after Charlie Hebdo, when the GTSE should be on high alert, they allowed President Hollande to go to a match where they had, prior to that, received security threats. We have conflicting reports of Israel having warned of Islamist attacks, which were then rescinded. But then still, within minutes or hours of the attack, Israel had produced information on exactly who the Islamists were, who'd perpetrated the attacks. All of this, the timing of the event, just prior to the climate summit, which was due in France, where Hollande had already been intimating that there would be possible public disorder because there were going to be protests against globalization and against austerity. So he was already putting out there that, look, this is a potential for terrorist attacks. We need to prevent these demonstrations. And lo and behold, we have a terrorist attack. And lo and behold, it now gives him the right to say, OK, I'm going to close borders to these protesters. They're not going to be allowed to Paris to protest globalization. And one other thing, we know, we've discussed this morning, the possibility that Saudi Arabia is using Academy Blackwater, that is the private security firm, to source mercenaries to take into Yemen to fight alongside Al-Qaeda there and ISIS that have now been taken there from Syria. So that's a very strong possibility that NATO is using these private security firms to source Wahhabized Islamists in Europe, or bringing them in from abroad to use them in these intel psy operations, basically. But coming on to
sorry, Vanessa. Look, we're just about to run out of time, so I just want to go back to Patrick if I can, because Pat, I'm sorry, Vanessa. We'll talk about this more some other time. Patrick, the media response is clearly. I want to discuss two things just quickly here. France 24 again, really getting concerned about information spreading through social media, and the mainstream media clearly a little concerned about that. So I'd like to get a comment on that if we can in the last couple of minutes. But the other thing that was amazingly coincidental was the fact that the G20 summit was beginning this weekend as well. And here we've got Obama and Putin on the sidelines because, of course, America and Russia, or at least America, doesn't want to be seen to be engaging with Russia in a serious way at this point. They are meeting on the sidelines. And if we look at the Telegraph here, this was a ridiculous article. Cameron and Obama urged Putin to back them over ISIS when in fact it was Russia that is taking the lead on this issue. I mean, we've got this situation where the mainstream media continues to push this rhetoric, and then they complain about the fact that in the social media there are other narratives appearing. It's a bit ironic that they should be making these complaints in this way, isn't it?
It is. Yeah, it is. If you're going to analyze mainstream media coverage in the context of some of these major events, if you're going to do it properly, you have to analyze it in the following way. There's parallel narratives. So the mainstream media is aligned with whatever comes out of politicians' press conferences or press statements out of the Foreign Office or the U.S. Secretary of State. The briefings there, that's good enough for all the press and all the major agencies there and all the major broadcast TV correspondents as well. So that's a parallel narrative. That's basically, in many ways, it's an imaginary narrative. So that's the fictional narrative that the media and the government departments are running. Then there's the real story, which runs alongside that. So in terms of the fictional narrative, the fictional narrative was that when Russia entered the Syrian conflict, that they weren't hitting ISIS targets, right? They were only propping up Bashar al-Assad and hitting U.S.-backed rebels, right? And so when Russia's plane gets shot down, or the bomb hit it, or whatever happened to it, we don't know. Could have been a mechanical failure. But immediately, David Cameron took the lead, actually, on this, and that it quite possibly, very likely, almost certainly likely, that this was an ISIS attack and so forth. And this is obviously in retribution. ISIS is angry about Russia hitting them in Syria. When for the previous 3 weeks, the West has maintained that Russia hasn't been hitting ISIS targets. So my question is, which is it? You can't have it both ways, and yet they do. They want to have it both ways. The coverage, the narratives, the logic is totally duplicitous. And what they're trying to do is create a logic that will fit the conflict, basically. And they pretty much do this on the fly, okay? Because the U.S. and because NATO, because the European countries are not dictating facts on the ground in Syria, because they're not on the ground. They've only got their Islamist fighting groups on the ground, but their really reliable partners have been mostly devastated by Russian airstrikes over the last 4 weeks. So they're not dictating facts on the ground. They're at a huge disadvantage in terms of being able to control and create and fashion the narrative like they do in some other places, like for instance to a large part in Yemen right now. That's completely skewed how that's being portrayed in the West. We can get to that on another program. But the point here is they're trying to maintain that Russia's been bombing hospitals, hasn't been hitting ISIS, and that's simply not true. Okay, I would put myself out on a limb to say that those are lies, and that's not a very strong word to use. If you look at sort of the rhetoric that's coming out of Western governments, why are they doing this? Because they're trying to gain some kind of a public relations advantage over Russia, so that they can use this to leverage some sort of political support for whatever their policies or idea of a policy, long-range policy or midterm policy might be. But it has nothing to do with reality. This is the problem. This is the mess that we're in right now. And I see a lot of Western politicians and media pundits, they're tripping over their shoelaces right now because they have spun such a extravagant web of lies ever since, well, in terms of Russia, it started with the Maidan in December 2013. But in terms of Syria, it's been lies right from the beginning. Okay, so I have yet to see a good video or some really good photographic evidence of Assad's barrel bombs, because they're saying they drop them every day and 10, 20 times a day. I haven't seen any evidence of it. So as far as I'm concerned, it's a mythology. It doesn't exist. It's only been created. It's a figment of Western imagination used to underpin whatever their foreign policy is, which obviously is regime change. So that's just one small example of the sort of parallel realities, parallel narratives that we have to contend with. If you don't realize there's a parallel narrative, that you've got the fictional one and the real one running parallel, if you don't know there's two, then you're just pretty much going to fall for whatever's coming through the television pipeline. So this is a huge problem. That's why there's a giant disconnect with regards to the public on this, and because most of it just doesn't make sense, Mike. It doesn't make sense. Why now they're saying Bashar al-Assad is the core problem in Syria, and he's the reason why ISIS has been able to propagate themselves in the region, because of Assad. This makes no sense. This is completely twisted logic. This is just conflict logic that's been invented, that's been contrived by our political so-called leaders, who are not doing a very good job of leading right now, and our compliant mainstream media, who take it all as gospel right as it comes off the tongue of William Hague or of John Kerry or whoever.
And indeed, and I mean, I think it's probably important just to remember who is. It doesn't matter who actually carried out this attack on Friday. Because at the end of the day, it is the likes of David Cameron, Barack Obama. These are the guys that are actually responsible for this.
Can I say one thing just to conclude, Mike?
Yes.
I'm gonna, proof that they don't know what they're talking about. They can't even decide what to name this terrorist menace group. Is it ISIS? Is it IS? Is it ISIL? They don't even have a consensus on that.
Sorry, Pat. It's not. Sorry, it's not that they don't know. They're making this up as they go along, aren't they?
They are, but it's proof that the whole narrative that's been fashioned is totally bogus. Okay, yeah. So they don't know what even to call it. They can't even decide on a name. Just like they couldn't decide on how to spell Muammar Gaddafi's name. There's about 12 different spellings of Gaddafi's name in English. So proof that it's completely bogus, in my opinion, and many other people's opinion too.
Yeah. Okay. So, have you got any closing remarks, Vanessa, on that?
Well, I mean, I think what I would like to say, and this is, we've touched upon it, but that humanity does exist outside of Europe and America and the States. And, the messages that were coming in from contacts and friends within Yemen and Iraq and Syria and Lebanon and Palestine is, hold on, what Paris went through on Friday night, Syria has gone through for pretty much 5 years every day. Yemen has gone through every day for 1 year. Palestine has gone through pretty much every day when you spread it out for 67 years. Iraq has gone through it since 1991 and is still going through it with the after effects of the depleted uranium and so on. So please let's put this into perspective, and please let's stop allowing the Western media to present humanity as purely being white and European-centric or US-centric. It isn't. It's global, and terror is global. It's created by our own governments, and that is what is creating the refugee crisis. It's creating the terror attacks in our own countries, and it's going to create the perfect storm. The chaos strategy will be one of the repercussions from this event. So we have to be alerted to this.
Okay, brilliant. Look, thank you very much, both of you for joining me. We're out of time. We'll do this again soon because this has worked quite well. This has been a horrendous event on Friday night, but as you say, we've got to keep it in perspective and see what the bigger picture is and who's actually responsible. Thank you both for joining me, and thanks everybody for watching, and we'll see you again same time tomorrow. Bye-bye.